In the summer of 1990, a man was hitchhiking along the Hume Highway in Australia on what he thought was the adventure of a lifetime. The driver who picked him up was friendly and the journey was off to a great start. Unbeknownst to the man though, the driver was actually a true monster, and what would happen in the next few moments would lead to the discovery of some of the most horrific crimes in Australian history. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Paul Onions was bored of life following his service in the British Navy. At only 24 years old in 1989, he had taken a job as an air conditioning repairman and was making a fine living, but he was still young and wanted to experience more of the world than he saw in the military. One of the top places on his list to visit was Australia, and when friends would ask him why he wanted to see the country so badly, he always replied that it might just be one of the last places on Earth where you could have a real adventure. That explanation was enough to satisfy the question, but it was also one that answered the yearning Paul felt in his soul for something more out of life. Finally, in January of 1990, he decided it was now or never, so he quit his job in Birmingham, England, and hopped on a plane bound for Sydney, Australia, with nothing more than a backpack's worth of belongings. When he arrived, he spent some time at a backpacker's hostel to figure out his plan for his extended visit. And knowing he needed to get a job to support himself, he heard about a fruit-picking opportunity in the city of Mildura, about 625 miles west of Sydney. He figured this would give him a chance to see more of the country, while the job itself would give him plenty of fresh air and sunshine, so he took a train to the outskirts of Sydney with plans of hitchhiking the Hume Highway to Mildura. Today, in many areas, the concept of hitchhiking is associated with danger and uncertainty, as you never know who might come along to pick you up. But in Australia, in the decades leading up to 1990, hitchhiking was a normal and economical way to travel, particularly for backpackers. Safety was by then sort of coming into question because between 1978 and 1991, several backpackers went missing, never to be seen again. And so by the mid-1990s, it was recommended that backpackers hitch rides in pairs. However, it was also still relatively common for people to hitchhike solo, as Paul was planning to do. Getting his adventure to Mildura underway, Paul stopped at a small store to pick up a drink when he was approached by a man who introduced himself as Bill. Bill saw Paul wearing a backpack and figured he needed a ride, so he offered it and Paul happily accepted. This was a relief because it meant he didn't have to stand endlessly on the side of the road to find a driver for the next leg of his journey. The pair then walked to Bill's truck and hopped in, setting off westward down the Hume Highway. Paul and Bill then got to know each other a bit with some small talk as the ride started out, and at first, Paul felt another sense of relief judging from their first few miles. Sometimes while hitchhiking, you can find yourself with someone who is more than a little off, but Bill seemed normal enough. That, though, would quickly change once Bill saw the opportunity to go on a racially charged rant about people from other countries living in Australia. The outburst made Paul roll his eyes and he tried to shut down the conversation, but things would only get more awkward. Paul then began to find it strange that Bill took such an interest in him and his plans. He would go on to ask if anyone knew where he was heading, if anyone was waiting for him at his destination, and if he had done any special forces training while in the military. This all struck Paul as more than just casual chit-chat, almost like Bill was digging for information he could use. However, as much as Paul wanted to continue the journey in complete silence, he was grateful for the ride and didn't want to upset Bill, so he played along while being sure not to reveal too much. For about an hour, Paul tolerated Bill's continued barrage of questioning until they were about 60 miles into the ride. Suddenly, Bill started to slow down and pulled off to the side of the road. He mentioned that they were starting to lose radio signals, so he wanted to get some cassette tapes from under the seat for them to listen to. This again immediately struck Paul as odd since there was already a selection of tapes in the center console, and if Bill had asked, Paul would have gladly reached under the seat to get them without the need to pull over. Bill then opened his door and got out of the truck before turning around and starting to fish for the tapes under the seat. As this was happening, there was just something about this turn of events that didn't feel right, so Paul got out of the truck too. Something about this then seemed to disturb Bill, and he asked Paul what he was doing. So sheepishly, Paul got back into the passenger seat and buckled himself back in. For a moment, Bill got back into the driver's seat with the tapes, but he just as quickly jumped back out, reached under a seat, and pulled out a handgun. Paul's eyes then widened as he was suddenly staring down the barrel of a .22 caliber pistol. Bill's demeanor was also immediately different, and he sternly told Paul that this was a robbery. In his other hand, Bill also had a piece of rope that immediately indicated to Paul that he had more in mind than just robbing him of what belongings he had. In that split second, Paul realized that whatever he did, he couldn't let Bill tie him up. So with no time to think and in one swift motion, Paul unbuckled his seatbelt, threw open the passenger side door, and ran onto the highway, which was busy with traffic. As he ran, he tried flagging people down, but at first no one would stop for him. And just then he heard a loud crack from behind him. Bill had actually taken a shot at Paul in an attempt to stop him, but the bullet missed him. And even more incredibly, the fact that there were people on the highway didn't seem to matter to Bill. He then caught up with Paul and the two started fighting right there in the middle of the road, with oncoming traffic having to swerve around them. At one point, it seemed like Bill had gotten the better of the situation and Paul was ready to give up, but he also knew what was likely to happen if he let Bill capture him, so he continued to fight back and got the upper hand and managed to escape Bill's grasp momentarily. He then had no choice but to stop the next car that passed by, even if it meant getting run down by it. He'd rather end up dead as a result of being hit by a car than whatever Bill had planned for him. As this was going on, a van was driving along the Hume Highway driven by Joanne Barry and her sister and 5 children. And seeing Paul running toward them and away from a man with a gun, Joanne slammed on the brakes. Paul then threw open the sliding door to the back of the van and begged for Joanne to help him get out of there. The fear in him was almost tangible as he got in and threw the door shut, so Joanne put the van in reverse, turned around, and started speeding away in the direction she came from. And horrifyingly, as they started to pull away, Paul turned back and saw Bill standing in the middle of the road with a grin on his face. As Joanne continued eastward, Paul explained what happened in between heavy gasps as he tried to catch his breath. And Joanne and her sister were stunned by what they were hearing as the van headed toward the town of Bowral. When they got there, they went straight to the police station so that she and Paul could report the incident. At the station though, the officer they spoke to seemed less than interested in the story and only jotted down a few notes. Without a last name or license plate, the officer explained there was little chance of ever finding the person responsible for the attack. Paul and Joanne couldn't believe what they were hearing as there was no urgency by police whatsoever to race up the highway to see if they could find the truck that matched the description they gave. Instead, the officer handed Paul a few dollars so he could make his way to the British Embassy and get his passport sorted out. In the scramble to get away from Bill, Paul had left his backpack behind, which had all of his belongings in it, and so unfortunately, that was the end of the case of the Hume Highway attack. In the immediate aftermath, Paul was able to get a new passport through the British Embassy and he cut his Australia trip short, returning home to Birmingham where he had little choice but to go about his life as normal. Almost 3 years would then pass without any word from Australian authorities when he picked up the morning newspaper in late 1992 and came across his story. Paul then read that the bodies of 2 backpackers were discovered in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales by a pair of runners and identified as 21-year-old Caroline and 22-year-old Joanne. The 2 women were hitchhiking together and seemed to be heading toward Victoria or Perth in Western Australia when they disappeared. Both were from the United Kingdom, and when they were finally found, it was learned that both had been the victims of a horrific crime. Joanne's body had 35 puncture wounds on her chest and back. One of these caused her to become paralyzed, making it completely impossible to fight back as the attack continued. At some point during this as well, she had also been both gagged and assaulted. Caroline, on the other hand, was found just 30 feet from Joanne, but she was blindfolded and shot many times. Indications at the scene also pointed to her being used as target practice before she succumbed to her injuries. As Paul was more and more disturbed by what he was reading, next to the article was a small map with marks to denote where the bodies were found. One of the towns included on it as a reference point caused his jaw to drop. It was Bowral. This vicious incident had occurred right within the vicinity of Paul's attack. About another year would pass when a man collecting firewood in the same state forest came across human remains determined to belong to 19-year-old backpackers Deborah and James. In December of 1989, the two left Melbourne for a festival similar to Burning Man where they had friends waiting for them, but the couple never showed up. They were reported missing in the days that followed, but just as with the report of Paul's attack, authorities showed little interest in the disappearance. And just like the other 2 women, James's remains showed signs of multiple puncture wounds, including one that also left him paralyzed before passing. Meanwhile, Deborah was almost unrecognizable because of the attack. Medical examiners found at least 2 severe skull fractures and marks on her forehead. The similarities between the 2 crime scenes finally forced police into action, and a task force of more than 20 detectives was formed in New South Wales. International backpackers were also then warned about the incidents and advised not to hitchhike along the Hume Highway as police were worried they had a serial offender on their hands. And in fact, on November 1st, 1993, a month after James and Deborah's remains were found, the body of a 21-year-old German backpacker named Simone was found in the Belanglo State Forest with multiple puncture wounds. Then, just 3 days later, during a search of the forest conducted by police, the bodies of 21-year-old Gabor and 21-year-old Anya, both German backpackers, were discovered in the same area. In this find, Gabor suffered 6 gunshots and Anya was found missing her head, although the skull was never located. Despite the body count rising, initially no one reached out to Paul, but in the few days following the discovery of the German backpackers, police would come to know him and the incident he endured very well. On November 5th, authorities announced a $500,000 reward for information leading to an arrest on whoever was responsible for the attacks. Joanne Barry, the woman who saved Paul from Bill, then learned about the latest finds, and she called police to retell the story of what happened that day in 1990. Several days later, the news hit Birmingham, England, and the article was accompanied by a tip hotline number that had been set up specifically for the case. Immediately, Paul picked up the phone and spoke with detectives about his experience near the Belanglo Forest with the man he knew as Bill. New South Wales police then contacted the Bowral Police Department to retrieve the report Paul claimed to have filed with them right after the attack. But despite an extensive search, frustratingly, no official record of the incident could be found. Thankfully though, although it was years later, the officer who spoke to Paul and Joanne was still working at the station and vaguely remembered the story. And fortunately as well, she had kept the notebook she used to record their statements and turn it over to the New South Wales Task Force. It was nothing more than a single-page set of notes that the officer never turned into an official report, likely due to a lack of license plate or last name of the attacker. Among the notes was a vague description of the driver described by Paul, who said that his attacker was somewhat muscular, with a handlebar mustache and resembled famous cricket player Dennis Lillee. Around the same time, a woman who identified herself as Mary also called the tip line to report that in 1977, a man fitting the same description tried to take her and her friend near Bowral while they were backpacking and hitchhiking the Hume Highway. Between these tips and the bodies recovered, several patterns seemed to emerge, pointing to the same person being responsible for all of them. This included that all the victims were backpackers, all the bodies were found in remote areas, most of the bodies also had multiple wounds, campsites were also found near each of the bodies, indicating to the police that the attacker spent time with the victims before and after death. And most notably, the same caliber bullets, shells, and cartridge boxes were found at or near each crime scene. When it comes to serial offenders, they often stick with a specific mode of operation, whether it be the manner of death or some signature that is unique to them. This tends to remain consistent, but in the case of the backpackers, some of the victims were attacked in different ways. In addition, some of the victims were also restrained in different ways, leading police to believe that it could be the work of multiple perpetrators. Either way, in their effort to narrow down a suspect list, police were confident that whoever was responsible had to be someone they were familiar with, and no one stood out more than a man named Ivan Milat. Ivan was born in 1945 into a very large family that included 14 siblings, 10 of which were brothers. And despite their father being a big believer in discipline and corporal punishment, the boys acted out often, and most of the time this would find them in trouble with the law. Their criminal records started piling up in their teenage years as the boys were fond of theft before graduating to breaking and entering. In fact, of the 10 brothers, 7 of them would become acquainted with the Australian legal system at a fairly young age, but Ivan in particular seemed to have a more significant deficit of character. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already served several jail sentences for burglary, and while not illegal, he was also caught having affairs with at least 2 of his brother's girlfriends. And most alarmingly, in reviewing his criminal past, the task force learned of an incident in 1971 involving Ivan and 2 backpackers who accused him of taking them and assaulting them. At the time of the incident, there was enough evidence for Ivan to face trial, but not enough to secure conviction, and he was acquitted of all charges. Later, he'd also become one of the prime suspects in the unsolved disappearances of 3 other women. Each vanished within 4 months of each other north of Sydney, where Ivan just so happened to be working in road construction at the time. And the circumstantial evidence only piled up from there. While interviewing his friends, several of them mentioned that Ivan had a love of violence and enjoyed talking about his knowledge of how to irreparably harm people. One of these friends even said that Ivan went into great detail one time about how to sever a spinal cord by a carefully placed puncture wound. And in addition, by the late 80s and early 90s, Ivan's construction job assigned him to repairs on the Hume Highway. This placed him in the vicinity of the attacks on Paul and Mary, as well as where the other 7 backpackers were known to be when they disappeared. And on top of everything else, he often hunted in the Belanglo State Forest. As all of this information was compiled, police became more and more certain that Ivan was their man, but there wasn't enough direct evidence to arrest him. So on February 26, 1994, police began surveillance on his house while detectives continued to work various angles. It wasn't until Paul's phone call to the hotline came in that things began to change though. Paul hopped on a flight to Australia in May, and as soon as he arrived, he met with the New South Wales Task Force. And when they put a series of mugshots in front of him, Paul immediately pointed to one photo in particular. His finger landed on Ivan, and this gave police probable cause to both place him under arrest and secure search warrants for his property. Finally, on May 22, 1994, Ivan was placed in handcuffs on robbery and weapons charges related to his attack on Paul. A thorough search of his house then produced several items confirmed to be those of these 7 dead backpacker victims. This included clothing, camping equipment, cameras, and foreign currency. More importantly, police found several .22 caliber weapons that were matches for the bullets and casings found at the crime scenes. And because of his family's criminal past, authorities speculated that Ivan might have had a sibling as an accomplice in the attacks. However, while search warrants executed on 5 of his brothers also uncovered property belonging to the victims, none of them were arrested, not even his brother named Bill. In any case, following his arrest, attempts to interrogate Ivan by the task force detectives didn't go terribly well. No matter what they presented or how hard they pressed him, Ivan wouldn't confess to any of the crimes. With the evidence they had though, both circumstantial and direct, police didn't feel like they needed a confession to put Ivan away for the rest of his life. So on May 23rd, Ivan was arraigned for the attack on Paul, and just a week later, he was officially charged in the deaths of these 7 missing backpackers. Several months later in October, a committal hearing was held, which is when a magistrate will hear the prosecution's evidence and determine if there's enough to merit a trial. This is somewhat similar to a grand jury indictment hearing in the United States. The committal hearing lasted 2 months, and more than 200 witnesses testified against Ivan, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. A criminal trial was then set for March 26, 1996 in front of the Supreme Court of New South Wales and lasted for 18 weeks. When the jury rendered its verdict, Ivan was found guilty and was given 7 life sentences, 1 for each of the backpackers, as well as 6 years for his attack on Paul, who was a crucial witness for the prosecution that led to Ivan's conviction. And this wouldn't be the last time the public heard from Ivan though. On the very first day of his sentence, he was brutally attacked by another inmate, and the following year he tried to escape prison and failed. Because of this, he was transferred to Goulburn Correctional Center, which is a supermax prison that houses the worst offenders in the country. He was also interviewed by a reporter in 2004 and maintained his innocence. Weirdly, he would even go on to say that even though much of his defense during the trial revolved around trying to pin the crimes on his brother, Richard, none of the other family members were actually involved in the crimes. And things only got stranger as time went on too. Ivan used a plastic fork to remove one of his fingers that he planned to mail to the High Court of Australia, believing that this would be the impetus for getting an appeal heard. It also wasn't uncommon for Ivan to swallow sharp metal objects as a form of protest against his conviction. He was also known to go on periodic hunger strikes and on one occasion refused to eat for 9 days, hoping this would prompt prison administration to give him a PlayStation. In 2019, Ivan was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, which was determined to be terminal. He spent his final days in a hospital and was visited nearly every day by police, hoping to get a confession for these 7 backpackers, plus the several other deaths and disappearances that seemed to have his distinct signature. But even in his last final moments, Ivan refused each opportunity and eventually died on October 27, 2019, without having admitted his guilt in the many cases. It was later learned, however, that he told his mother that he was indeed the man who attacked these 7 backpackers. As a final note on the case, in 2012, Matthew Milat, Ivan's great-nephew, was found guilty of a 2010 attack of his friend with an axe in the Belanglo State Forest and was sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. A cellmate of his would later come forward to tell police that Matthew bragged to him about the attack, stating, quote, "That's what Milats do," end quote. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.